Hey Fit Moms, I wanted to do a short video on some common but important posture cues that you will hear in our exercise videos. So the first one is a chin tuck, and this is just referring to the positioning of your chin. So believe it or not, whether you're looking up or down can impact your pelvic floor and your ability to engage your abdominals. So it's important, as we say, to make sure you're tucking your chin, just to make sure that your head is at least in alignment with your spine and that your chin is coming down. As you get fatigued, like say you're doing a jump rope, it's common for people to start to lift their chin, and this actually unengages your pelvic floor and your abdominals, leading to potential injury, but also issues like incontinence and other things. Next up is shoulders down and back. Now what we mean by this is just simply like, think about taking your shoulders, rolling them back, and just putting them in your back pockets. I'm not hyperextending my back, which would produce some rib flare, which we'll talk about in a second. I'm just rolling them down and back while keeping a neutral posture. Now this is not something that we want to focus on all the time in our daily life, where we're pulling our shoulders down and back, because that's actually engaging some muscles, and you can't work the same muscles all day long without fatiguing them. So when we do a down and back, it's really, the point is to bring your shoulders down from your ears, because oftentimes when things get hard, we start to clench, right? So shoulders down and back, it's just an exercise cue to bring your shoulders down away from your ears, but without hyperextension. Next up is rib flare. We have a whole video on rib flare where you can actually test yourself. But to think about rib flare, think about having a bowl here for your ribs and your diaphragm. And for rib flare, you would actually be tilting that bowl up. So a lot of people, when they think about having confidence, they think about having their chest out and proud. Well, there's a difference between having rib flare and actually sticking your ribs up, which is changing your alignment and is not good, versus being proud and, like I talked about, having your shoulders down and back in the proper way, but keeping proper alignment. You can be confident and strong without having rib flare. Another piece to check for, which is listed in this video, is one-sided rib flare. This can really create an imbalance and lead to incontinence and other issues like lower back pain and headaches and things like that. So make sure to check out the rib flare video for more information on that one. Neutral posture or canister, you will hear these terms a lot, especially neutral posture. So what we're talking about is you have your diaphragm here, you have your pelvic floor down here. So pretend that these are two different sides to a canister or a cylinder, right? You have a top floor, bottom floor, and then a nice torso in between in this case. So when we talk about your canister, we're really just talking about from your diaphragm down to your pelvic floor. Neutral posture means making sure that these are aligned. Now there's a difference between, most people have an anterior pelvic tilt, which I'll explain in a little bit, which just means you have a light bow in your lower back. This is completely normal, this is how your back should look, but when we're exercising and we're bringing load onto our body, we really want to make sure that that canister is in neutral posture. And there's multiple reasons, especially with pressure. So when we're breathing in, we're putting pressure down on the pelvic floor, and we need to make sure that we're taking care of all of our muscles as we exhale and we pull up on that pelvic floor. So with posture, if I'm standing in my normal posture right now, and we're about to do a squat, and we say neutral posture, that just means I should be using my core to bring my pelvis in a little bit and align my ribs and my hips. Okay, now there is a difference between using your core to pull versus squeezing my glutes to pull. When we're saying neutral posture, use your lower belly, your core, to pull your canister into alignment. The next cue is diaphragmatic breathing. This just means that you're breathing with your diaphragm and you're expanding your rib cage and your back as you're breathing. A lot of people breathe through their shoulders, they breathe through their belly, where their belly is actually protruding out, or they breathe in thinking about sucking in their belly button and they actually breathe underneath their ribs. We have a whole different video on different types of breathing and why diaphragmatic is beneficial, but if we cue it in a fitness class, that just means to make sure that you're breathing through your rib cage so that your pressure within your whole canister and your system is going in the right places. thoracic spine, and lumbar curve. Now these both refer to places in your back. So we have our cervical spine up on top, thoracic spine, which is in the middle, and lumbar, which is in the bottom. Your lumbar spine should not move much. It's not made for mobility, whereas your thoracic spine needs lots of mobility. That's the area where you should be twisting from. So oftentimes we'll cue you to twist through your thoracic spine, and you should think about your mid-back doing the motion, not going through your lower back and your hips. When it comes to your lumbar curve, we're going to talk about this a lot with not hyperextending. Hyperextending means that you're getting a really big bow in your back. Again, going back to neutral posture, you want your ribs over your hips. There is not a huge bow going into my back right now, and this is going to allow me to take a load. Whereas if I'm sticking my butt out essentially with a large lumbar curve, this could get me in some trouble and lead to some injury. Next up is diastasis. You will hear this term in every single video, most likely, either diastasis recti or DR for an abbreviation. This refers to abdominal separation. So when you're pregnant and you have a baby in your belly, it has to create some space, right? So our pelvis gets moved, our ribs get shifted up, and our belly expands, which also means that your abs split apart, creating that linea alba right here, making it more stretched. And so after the baby comes out, things start to return back to normal, but for a lot of people, they end up still having a diastasis, which is essentially an abdominal split. We have another video on this one as well. We highly recommend and encourage you to please test yourself for DR before you even jump into any of our fitness classes, because there are some exercises that can make DR worse, and there are some that you can do safely even if you have a diastasis. But it's just really important to know your width, your depth, and how firm it is before you jump into any exercise, whether it's with us or somewhere else. Oh, the TVA, this is our favorite muscle. We talk about it all the time. So your transverse abdominis is your innermost core muscles. Think about it as being a corset, essentially, so it runs horizontally. There's three different layers. There's the top part, the middle part, and then the lower part. So your transverse abdominals actually cover your entire torso. But mostly what we're talking about when we talk about your TVA is your lower transverse abdominals. And the reason why is because if these are not firing, which most people's are not, if these are not firing, it can lead to issues with diastasis healing. It can lead to lower back pain. These muscles are attached to your pelvic floor. So if you're having prolapse or incontinence or other issues that just make you really uncomfortable with exercise, it's important to learn how to engage your TVA so that you can do that neutral spine using your core. You can do things without hyperextending your back, and you can do them to stay safe. The pelvic tilts, we talk about these a lot, especially in relation to neutral spine. So an anterior pelvic tilt or posterior pelvic tilt. I want you to think about your hips being a bucket right now and it's full of water. An anterior pelvic tilt would be that you're tipping to the front, the anterior side, and you have water spilling out the front, okay? Neutral posture is that your bucket is nice and flat. Posterior pelvic tilt is when you actually tuck your butt under and you tilt toward the back. A lot of women actually have posterior pelvic tilt as they're freshly postpartum because their back end is so used to having to fire to hold the weight that's in the front. So this is a big issue because when you're giving birth, whether you're on your back or you're squatting or your hands and knees, you are typically in a posterior pelvic tilt, which means that this is the body's ideal place to get something out. Now, after you've had your baby, there is more risk of prolapse or other issues where things are coming out easier that you don't want coming out if you are maintaining a posterior pelvic tilt all the time. This is going to lead to glute clenching, where you see people walking a little bit tight on their back end. This is something that we need to be aware of. So most people have a slight anterior pelvic tilt. This is the ideal position. But when we are doing exercise, like I mentioned, you want to have a neutral spine so that you have a straight up and down canister and you can handle the pressure and load. So we do cue a posterior pelvic tilt once in a while, but you have to think about where you're starting from. If you naturally start here and we say, okay, light posterior pelvic tilt to get to neutral posture, make sure that you're paying attention to where your starting position is and how you get to neutral posture. Most people, like I mentioned, are anterior, so we're cueing them to use their core, do a slight posterior pelvic tilt to get to neutral, but not tucking and squeezing through their glutes. Hip hinge, this is the starting point for really any lower body exercise. Specifically, you'll see it in the squat, deadlift, lunges, things like that. So when we're going into a squat, just as an example, we do not want to see your body going straight down and forward where your knees are going over your toes unless you have a support in something like bar where it's an intentional exercise to help certain muscle groups. For a traditional squat, you want to do a hip hinge where your butt is coming back like you're going to sit into a chair, and then you start to lower, okay? So when we're talking about the hip hinge, it just means that your hips are the first thing starting, you're hinging here, and then you're going into the movement. A great way to practice this is to go up against a wall, stand about 12 inches, 8 inches away from a wall, and just raise your hands up like you're going to go into a squat, tap the wall with your butt. Come back up. Tap the wall with your butt. Come back up. Just practice that motion so that you can get in the right habits as you're starting to add exercise, and then adding intensity to exercise, and then adding weight to exercise. Oh, the wonderful Kegel. Everyone talks about these, right? Women need to do more Kegels. Well, for some women, that's true, and for others, you may not need those if you have a tight pelvic floor, but that's for a whole different discussion. For a Kegel, though, if we are cueing them in class, there are two things we want you to focus on. Not just the squeeze like you're trying to stop urine, but also a lift, okay? So there's actually two different layers to your pelvic floor. The first one closest to the outside, the superficial ones, they squeeze. The deep muscles of the pelvic floor are going to help lift. They are both super important. So when you're doing a Kegel, I like to often say, think about if you're zipping from your lady parts up to your belly button. So you're squeezing and then lifting. And if you do that properly, you'll also feel that TBA engage as well. All right, these last ones are really kind of easy and self-explanatory, but we say them a lot, and I want to make sure that everybody understands what we're talking about. So knees over your second toe, all that means is that you want to keep your knees in alignment with your feet. Oftentimes we will experience weakness in our adductors or our abductors, and if I'm doing a squat, you might see if you look down, your knees bowing out or your knees bowing in. It's really important to pay attention for your knee health, your foot health, your hip health, everything, that your knees are tracking right over those toes when we're cueing you to do that. The other piece is that traditionally with squats, you're cued to keep your weight through your heels, which isn't a bad cue, but it's really important to keep your toes down, because what we've discovered is that by keeping your toes down, you have more abdominal strength and tension. If you lift your toes up, you actually lose some of your abdominal strength. So it's important to keep your toes down. Your weight should be as distributed as possible through your feet. Think about trying to spread your toes and put all your weight down through your feet. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions on any of the cues, please reach out to Drea or myself. We want to make sure that you're exercising safely, so we are happy to clarify any other questions that you may have.